fascinating listening to everybody here and tying it back to the conversations that we're having yesterday. So in the last, since '88, introduction of the national curriculum and an increasingly compliant, detailed regulation for teachers, from minute details down to individual lesson plans. Comparing that, the parallel of teacher education, moving into a very highly trained profession. My question is, opening up the curriculum to develop a principled-led curriculum, at the same time the vast majority of teachers who've been trained in that period of time have been very, very well trained, and what level of understanding have the majority of the profession now got in understanding the philosophy of education, the psychology, and I would add the sociology of education. Because all of you have talked about individual products, and we've not talked about the whole construct of society. I think there's a link there between what we are expected to do now as professionals, creating a principled-led curriculum, and having a highly trained but perhaps not well-educated teaching profession. That's a question.
Okay, thank you very much for that very significant question, which perhaps the panellists can be thinking about that, and one or two could contribute. Shall we have the other question here as well?
Can you tell us a little bit more about beyond levels and in terms of assessment and that schizophrenia between the fear that Bill talked about and having to prove progress at every single second for Ofsted inspectors, and yet the need for really good formative systems of assessment beyond the national curriculum levels?
Okay, thanks very much. So two nicely different sort of questions there, one big principles, one quite specific, particularly about aspects of assessment. Does anyone want to kick off on either of those questions that takes their fancy? Susan, do you...
Okay, I was really, when you started talking about the sort of sociology and philosophy of education, I was thinking about a challenge which I had when I was head of maths, and I had people in my maths department who weren't mathematicians. And I used to think about how can they develop mathematical thinking in the people, in the children they're teaching, when actually they can't think mathematically themselves. And I think that gets to the heart of it. We're asking teachers to train and teach children to think in ways that perhaps those teachers themselves are, at this time, not able to think for themselves. I think that's probably the kind of thread that you're building. I think that's a real challenge for us, but that's something which we can do by giving people, as school leaders, we can give the teachers in our schools that confidence to experiment, encourage them to experiment, because the school itself can provide that safety net and can provide that means of doing that. And it only takes one person in a faculty or a department who's got that idea, that we encourage them to develop that idea and to develop that practice in the school. And I think that's, I know exactly what you mean, but I think we've got to start somewhere, and it will start with seeing with the small seeds that we see every day in our schools and looking for opportunities to celebrate and develop that practice through our in-service training and staff development programmes.
Thank you. Tim?
Thanks very much. Very, very important question. We could spend a great deal of time on it because there are so many dimensions to what you said. I'm going to answer it in two ways, and then obviously the levels question is a really fundamental one. The first is just a historical point. It is absolutely the case that curriculum development skills and assessment strategy development skills are no longer as present in our young teachers as they were present in teachers 20 years ago. It's very, very clear. And it's also clear 2 decades ago that we did have a different means of generalizing really good curriculum practice. So we did have things like SMP Maths and Nuffield Science, which originated in curriculum development in schools, and then were fed up to institutional structures, which meant that they could be disseminated widely through the education system. Now, that's not a kind of golden ageism. It's actually recognizing that there were some very important aspects of professional practice which the revisions to the national curriculum are now calling for, which are not present in the majority of our existing teaching force. That's not knocking teachers, it's actually being very clear about the implied expectations in the revised policy. There is an antidote, And I think an antidote comes in the form of mutual exchange and collaboration at the level of the school. I put in my presentation a very brief reference to lesson observation. Now, it's very clear that lesson observation within schools has dramatically lifted the attainment and performance of certain institutions. And there are a number of very important case studies. The mutual sharing of good practice within the institution, absolutely critical. Ian Craig's work in Kent also shows that a sensible unit in our very diverse education system is about 25 schools in the context of Kent. Schools that are near enough for teachers to be able to move from one school to another for, say, an hour's discussion about a particular aspect of curriculum development, but not so close they're directly competing. And that really worked in Kent. So that's the first answer to it. The second answer to it, your question, that I want to give is very short and very provocative. And that is the pervasive set of ideas associated with postmodernism. And Andy Green gives a compelling and very succinct demolition of postmodernist thinking in education and globalization in the state. And he said that postmodernists continue to talk for long after they've got nothing left to say. And he says that in many cases, educational theorists have not recovered from the moral shock of finding that there are actually different moral frameworks in different cultures. And it means that we often think we're imposing things on children, and all we're doing is giving them access to ideas. And the reason I'm worried about that is that I came across an academic recently who said, well, I don't think we can have a conversation about this because I don't believe in a knowledge-based curriculum. And I just don't know what that actually means. And I think it's an incredibly impoverished way of thinking about the curriculum, but boy, is it pervasive. And it really is associated with this notion that because things are so relative, if you actually lead somebody to a precise understanding of something, somehow you're imposing on them, morally or intellectually. And I just think that's an entirely bankrupt way of thinking about the curriculum.
Thank you. Did you a quick comment on levels? And then we really want to wrap
levels.
up,
Yeah, I mean, Singapore does it, Roxham does it, they do it brilliantly, they don't need them. I do think that this may sound very, very regressive, but actually it's intended to be very empowering. I think we should only be bothered about attainment in terms of what the state should be interested in. And that sounds as though the state shouldn't be interested in value added. I think the state should be interested in value added. I think all schools should be legally required to have a progress measurement system in place. And that should indicate over time that the school is improving. You look at year-on-year improvement in the outcomes in education that the school is actually deriving, as well as the well-being of children and so on and so on and so on. But a school should adopt the process which is best attuned to its needs, and that system should allow improvement in successive years to be demonstrated. And the state should be interested in the fact that a school has a scheme for that. But it should not be used as a quantitative measure and imposed across the whole of the system. Now, it's a very controversial view, but I think there are very good reasons for that, and that's what I've said to the NHT Commission, chaired by Stuart Sutherland. The state should be interested in attainment at 11 and in the fact that schools have a process in place for measuring value added and progress, but that system should be determined by schools and externally inspected, of course, for its probity and reliable and dependability.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And there's a whole further session there, I think, probably. But as there is on much of this, and really to say this is an ongoing debate is to state the utterly obvious. But I think what all of us are grateful to is for all four of you for giving some really helpful and interesting reflections, making us reflect further, think, question more, but moving us on, I think, in terms of, well, what is it that we're trying to do? And ultimately, and perhaps particularly Susan would say, that then works in schools where we try and work these things out. So shall we round off this session?